At 21, Eliza Rowe was homeless, hungry, and one Wyoming frost away from sleeping in the willow wash beyond Cottonwood Ford, because Cyrus Vane had cast her out after calling in her dead father's note, and because she refused, in his lamp-bright office and under the patient tick of his clock, to sign away the smokehouse parcel he kept calling worthless. All she had left in the world was $2.83 sewn into the band of her petticoat, and with two of those dollars, on a wind-scoured afternoon in the autumn of 1893, she did the most foolish thing anyone in town believed a ruined girl could do. She bought the crumbling smokehouse that stood behind the old Rowe yard, the one with the sagging roof, the soot-black walls, and the curing rack everyone said would come down with the first hard snow. It was a desperate purchase, and not even she could have explained it then except to say that 4 walls were 4 walls, even if they smelled of old salt and ash. What she did not know, as she laid her blanket down beneath that warped roof, was that a secret hatch waited under the curing rack, and beneath that hatch slept the papers, promises, and buried truth that would give her family name back its shape and hand an ailing town the means to stand upright again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eliza Rowe. If you are listening from a place people have overlooked too long, tell us in the comments. Cottonwood Ford sat where the river narrowed over pale stones, and the plains rose gradually toward the darker backs of the Laramie Hills, and in Eliza's earliest years it still possessed the unembarrassed confidence of a settlement young enough to think usefulness and permanence were the same thing. Freight wagons crossed there before the thaw, and after it. Ranch hands brought beeves down from open range, hunters came through with hides, and families in patched coats arrived from farther east, with trunks tied in rope, and all the noble confusion of people trying to turn chance into home. The town had no grand avenue to speak of, only a broad main street that became a river of dust in summer and a trough of mud in spring. But along it stood the mercantile, the small bank counter tucked into Cyrus Vane's back office, the church with its white paint already peeling at the sill corners, the livery, the schoolhouse, 3 warehouses by the freight yard, and beyond them the boarded houses and outbuildings of families who had once expected grandchildren to inherit not just roofs, but security. Among those buildings, set a little apart and always carrying its own dark, sweet smell of hickory smoke, salt, pepper, and oak ash, stood the Rowe smokehouse. To strangers it looked plain, almost stern, a square-built cedar structure on a limestone footing with narrow vents near the roofline, and a heavy door hung on black iron strap hinges. But to those who knew anything of frontier hunger, it was closer to a promise than a building. Eliza's grandmother, Martha Rowe, had raised it in the bad years after the winter of '78, when too many calves died in drifts, too many flour sacks emptied before the thaw, and too many families learned that weather does not care how carefully hope has been budgeted. Martha had been widowed young and possessed that fierce practical pity particular to women who have buried enough to stop confusing tenderness with softness. She bought hogs and tough cattle too scrawny for elegant buyers, cured what others could not keep, smoked what others might have wasted, and sold it fair when she could, or extended credit when she must, or wrote no charge at all beside the names of widows, fever houses, and men whose teams had broken down 2 counties from decent help. People said she knew every kind of hunger by sight, and people were right. By the time Eliza was born, Martha was already legend in the quiet local way that never reaches newspapers, and yet determines whether a town remains human. Eliza's father, Samuel Rowe, inherited the smokehouse from that formidable woman, along with the boarding yard, a strip of river meadow, and a manner of work that seemed less like ambition than duty remembered. He was not as commanding as Martha had been, But he was steady in the old manner, broad-shouldered, deliberate, and gifted with hands that could mend a wagon tongue, shape a barrel hoop, patch a stove flue, or split a length of cottonwood so neatly it looked as if the grain itself had volunteered. Her mother, Lydia Rowe, had come west from Nebraska with a teacher's hand and a voice that could take the quarrel out of a room without anybody later recalling exactly how she had done it. From Samuel, Eliza learned the grammar of usefulness, how to test a board for hidden rot by tapping it near the nail line, how to stack split wood so rain ran off instead of settling in, how to judge wind from the movement of sage tips in the distance, how to save bent nails in a tobacco tin because another roof, another storm, another need would come, and a good person ought never to throw away tomorrow's rescue. From Lydia, she learned account columns, clear penmanship, quiet endurance, and the sharper kind of honesty that does not merely tell the truth when asked, but recognizes falsehood wearing its good coat and polished boots. If Samuel taught her craft, and Lydia taught her measure, Martha taught her the smell and soul of the smokehouse itself. When Eliza was still little enough to vanish under a hanging apron, she would follow her grandmother into that cool, dim room where strips of meat hung from rails, hams rested in salt, crocks stood along the wall, and the air held the deep, almost sacred odor of patience. Martha showed her how to rub in cure evenly with strong thumbs, how to keep flies off by tending the draft just right, how smoke should kiss meat rather than bully it, and how a structure built for preservation also preserved the dignity of whoever came to its door needing food in a thin season. Spoilage begins where neglect begins, Martha used to say, tying up a muslin sack of peppercorns with fingers knotted by work and weather, in pantries, in fields, in promises, in people. Attend early, and you save more than supper. Eliza kept that line in her mind long after the woman herself had been laid under Wyoming soil, with the cottonwoods whispering overhead. In those years the Rowe place was not rich, but it was useful in a way that often looked richer from a distance. The boarding table filled most evenings with drovers, teamsters, 2 schoolmasters in successive winters, and once a geologist with boots so poor that Lydia mended them between courses while he tried not to notice. The smokehouse supplied ranch kitchens for miles around. River meadow grass fattened hogs enough to matter. Eliza grew up among wagon tongues, spice sacks, curing hooks, and guest stories from Nebraska, Texas, Cheyenne, and places beyond that she could scarcely picture except as changes in weather and accent. We know there are children who learn the world from maps, and others who learn it from footsteps on a porch. Eliza was one of the latter kind. By 14, she could tally an invoice without blotting, render lard, mend harness stitching, salt beef for travel, and look at a man's face long enough to decide whether he was merely tired or near collapse. Yet the frontier does not reward usefulness consistently, and towns that once seemed anchored can begin slipping almost before the people in them admit they are moving. First, the rail spur chose a route 7 miles south, close enough to wound, too far to help. Then 2 dry summers came back to back, and a cold spring after them took calves and gardens with equal indifference. Freight shifted. Travelers found quicker roads. The boarding yard thinned. Men who once paid their accounts by season now asked for extension by month. Samuel Rowe worked harder precisely as income shrank, which is a noble response, and often a ruinous one. Lydia quietly watered down soup, stretched coffee with roasted barley, and kept the books with a hand so calm, nobody seeing them would know how often she had to recast figures before sleep. Martha, already aging, held them all together by the force of old will, until her heart finally gave out one blue dawn after a week of unseasonable wind. Eliza was 16 then, old enough to understand that some deaths remove not only a person, but a center of gravity. After Martha's burial, the smokehouse kept standing exactly where it always had, yet the Rowe place felt altered in a way that no repair could touch. Samuel still worked before daylight, and after it, Lydia still held the table steady, and Eliza still moved through the day as competent as any grown woman. But with Martha gone, the family had lost the one person broad enough of shoulder to make every other burden seem briefly carryable. It was during these narrowing years that Cyrus Vane became more than the town's merchant and banker, and settled into the more dangerous role of being its interpreter. He bought notes from men too tired to understand the difference between delay and surrender. He took deed shares as collateral, warehouse stock as security, cattle brands against seed loans, and always in that polished voice suggesting he regretted necessity even as he arranged it. He was not loud, which fooled some. He did not bully in saloons or storm porches. His harm was tidier. He made ruin look procedural. He turned need into paperwork, and then blamed paper for what he had meant from the start. Lydia distrusted him from the beginning. Eliza saw it in the way her mother's mouth would flatten when his wagon stopped by the porch, and in how she always read any document he brought twice before letting it rest on the table. Vane had particular interest in the Rowe holdings, though he never named that interest plainly. He spoke, instead, of efficiencies, of separating non-productive structures from arable use, of liquidating sentiment and focusing on viable trade. He called the smokehouse outdated. He suggested the river meadow would sell better if detached from old curing rights. He asked, with practiced mildness, whether Samuel had considered relinquishing the smokehouse parcel altogether and renting a smaller shed nearer town. Samuel refused every time, sometimes with patience, sometimes without it, because a man who has spent his life preserving food for others understands insult when he hears it draped in business language. Still, refusal costs something when the other party keeps the ledger. Then came the year Eliza lost nearly everything at once. First, Lydia took sick in a late spring fever that moved fast, burned high, and left the house with a silence too large for its rooms. She died with Eliza's hand in hers, and, in one of those unbearable mercies grief gives us, with her senses still clear enough to whisper, "Read before you yield." And if he wants the smokehouse, ask yourself why. Samuel never recovered properly from that loss, though he continued standing upright for the sake of standing. He borrowed against the next season's hogs. He mortgaged the west shed. He took on every repair job within 2 counties. Then, during the first snow of that winter, he went out with 2 neighbors to haul a stranded family's wagon from the river bend, and came home wet through, coughing from the cold and the effort. The cough settled into his chest and stayed. By February, he was thinner than Eliza had ever seen him. By March, he was dead. Grief in young women is too often mistaken for pliancy. Cyrus Vane misjudged her on that point. He waited exactly 12 days after Samuel's funeral before inviting Eliza to his office, where the stove was warm. The brass inkstand gleamed, and his pity had already been arranged like merchandise. He spread the Rowe note, the revised interest, the feed charges, the accumulated extensions, and the penalties across the desk with almost pastoral neatness. The house, the boarding yard, the river meadow, the sheds, and all appurtenances, he said, now stood beyond realistic recovery. But because he respected the memory of Samuel Rowe, And because he understood a young lady's vulnerability, he was prepared to be merciful if she would sign a release on the smokehouse tract and the curing rights attached to its original plat. In exchange, he would reduce the debt, allow her a modest board at Mrs. Clegg's for a few weeks, and perhaps find her clerical work entering orders at the mercantile. Eliza had come frightened. She had not come witless. The smokehouse tract appeared 3 times in that document, each mention dressed in different legal clothes and more exact than any worthless outbuilding required. She thought of Lydia's last warning and asked, as evenly as she could, why a non-productive smokehouse mattered to him. Cyrus smiled in the way some men do when they are disappointed by intelligence in the wrong room. "Titles like completeness," he said. "Loose threads invite trouble." She folded the paper and said she would not sign. The change in him was not dramatic. Men like Cyrus Vane rarely spend anger recklessly. He only became a degree colder, as though a door within him had shut on warmth he had not especially meant. There followed the slow humiliations by which a person is emptied out. Mrs. Clegg did give her a room for 6 nights in exchange for laundering, but when Vane mentioned that extension of store credit depended on orderly relations with his office, the widow began twisting her apron and speaking of impossibility. The Row boarding house contents were catalogued and sold in lots. A walnut chest Lydia cherished went for less than a good pair of boots. Samuel's tools scattered through town. Hogs were taken against feed notes. The river meadow passed into Vane's book. Eliza kept what she could carry: a blanket, the family Bible, Lydia's account ledger, Samuel's hammer, 2 dresses, a tin cup, and the $2.83 her mother had once sewn into a petticoat band, with the firm belief that every woman ought to maintain one hidden line of defense against the world. She spent one night in the school woodshed under Miss Penrose's reluctant kindness, another behind the church in a lean-to used for hymnals, and a third in the livery loft where horses shifted beneath her, and sleep came only in splinters. What hurts most in such days is not always hunger or even fear, but visibility without belonging. Cottonwood Ford did not become monstrous toward Eliza. It did something perhaps more common and nearly as cruel. It became busy with its own precariousness. People nodded, looked sorry, and moved on. Cyrus Vane's credit ran through too many kitchens for easy rebellion. Men who had eaten at the Row table for years lowered their eyes on the boardwalk. Women who had once borrowed jars, salt, or comfort from Lydia spoke in hushed tones about propriety and uncertainty. If anyone still wondered why the smokehouse tract mattered, they wondered quietly. Eliza herself might have fled south to the rail line by then, had not the county posted a scavenger and tax sale notice on the freight shed wall, listing miscellaneous detached structures to be cleared from foreclosed property, among them the Row smokehouse. The sale took place on a day so windy the auctioneer had to hold his hat with one hand and his papers with the other. Men came for wagon parts, fencing wire, 3 cracked troughs, a grain scale, and a stack of warehouse planks. When the smokehouse lot came up, a little laughter moved through the crowd before bidding even opened. The structure stood blackened, leaning slightly, its shingles lifted in one corner, and its curing yard half swallowed by weeds. One man said he would rather buy a coffin already used than that old box of soot. Another suggested it might make acceptable kindling if split before the snow. Eliza stood at the back in Lydia's worn coat and listened without flinching, because when a person has already slept under borrowed roofs, mockery has less sting than people imagine. The auctioneer asked for $5, then 4, then 3. No one answered. Eliza heard her own voice, small but steady, say, "Two." Heads turned. Someone laughed outright. The auctioneer, eager to move on, struck his crate with the mallet. Just like that, for $2, she bought the most disregarded structure in Cottonwood Ford, and became, at least on paper, the owner of one crumbling smokehouse. She spent that first afternoon not thinking about mystery or destiny or any of the larger shapes hindsight later gives a day like that, but about draft, shelter, and whether the roof might hold two more storms. The interior smelled of old smoke sunk deep into cedar, mouse droppings, stale grease, and the mineral coolness of stone that had not seen steady fire in years. Hooks still hung from crossbeams. The big curing rack stood along the north wall, a broad slatted frame used once for resting sides of pork before hanging. On the floor lay peppercorns turned to grit, a rusted scoop, 2 cracked crocks, and a tin of salt gone solid as rock. Eliza swept with a sagebrush broom until her wrists ached, opened the vent slats, patched one broken shutter with a feed crate board, and wedged rags into the worst of the door gaps. By dusk the room was still poor, still dark, still clearly one hard winter from further surrender, but it belonged to her in the modest legal sense that no one could that night turn her out of it. She rolled herself in her blanket beneath the curing rack and let the old smell of hickory cling to her hair like a memory refusing to leave. On the second morning she began examining the place the way Samuel would have done, because grief, when it has nowhere useful to go, often turns itself toward maintenance. She tested the wall planks for softness, counted missing shingles from inside by the stars of daylight showing through, sorted salvageable iron from rubbish, and brushed years of soot from the rack's lower rails. That was when she noticed the first thing that did not fit. The right side of the curing rack had been bolted to the floor with 4 square-headed screws blackened by age. The left side bore only 2 such screws, and beneath the slat nearest the wall, half hidden under grease and dust, something round glinted faintly. She knelt, scraped with her thumbnail, and revealed not a screw head at all, but a small iron ring flush set into the floorboards. Her pulse changed then, as though some older current had found it. The rack was heavy, but hunger had not made Eliza weak so much as intent. She pried the left support loose with Samuel's hammer claw, dragged the rack 6 inches, and tugged at the ring. A narrow hatch lifted, stiff at first, and then with a soft gasp, releasing a breath of cool air from the darkness below. Underneath lay a shallow limestone chamber no wider than a coffin and much cleaner smelling than the smokehouse itself, with old cedar shelves lining one side and, on the floor, a waxed canvas bundle, a leather ledger bound with a cracked strap, and a small tin box greened around the clasp. For a long moment Eliza simply knelt there, one hand on the hatch edge, while the room around her seemed to recede, and the chamber below gathered all the light. She had found not coin, not jewels, not the kind of fortune idle men dream about when they talk of secret spaces, but papers, and because Lydia had trained her properly. Papers frightened and thrilled her more than gold might have done. The ledger came first. Its cover was rubbed nearly smooth, but inside the flyleaf, in Martha Rowe's unmistakably forceful hand, stood the words, Household and Winter Accounts, 1879-1888. Beneath them, added in fainter ink years later, was one sentence that made Eliza sit down on the cold floor at once. If this book is found by Rowe blood after hard times, let her read to the end before she trusts any man calling this place worthless. She looked up instinctively, as though Martha might be leaning in the doorway in her apron and rough shoes. about to explain everything in that dry voice of hers. But only wind moved at the vent slats. Eliza opened the tin box next. Inside lay a brass key stamped R4, 2 bank deposit receipts from Cheyenne dated long before her birth, and a folded note so brittle at the corners she feared breaking it. The note had been written by Lydia, not Martha, and time had browned it. But the words were clear enough. Father says Vane is pressing again. Mother believes the smokehouse tract guards more than the tract itself. If we must hide the originals elsewhere, page 63 will remember for us. Page 63. Eliza turned through the ledger slowly, first seeing what any outsider would have seen: columns of hams cured, bacon sides sold, barrels packed, salt bought, firewood stacked, and names beside them, dozens and dozens of names from Cottonwood Ford and beyond. Yet Martha's accounts had never been merely commercial. Whole pages recorded no-charge deliveries to fever houses, winter allotments for isolated homesteads, and bridge camp meet against town, benefit in a script sharper and more deliberate than the surrounding entries. On page 63 the ordinary column lines continued, but in the right margin, squeezed between numbers for pepper and salt, Martha had written in code like fragments: meadow patent tied to smokehouse easement, trust not void if house falls, ledger alone not enough, ask what lies behind the old curing wall marked with the 3rd peg. Cyrus's father knew, and meant to sever it. Eliza read the lines 3 times, each slower than the last. The smokehouse tract guarded more than itself. The trust not void if house falls. Cyrus's father knew. The words felt less like information than like a hand reaching across years with urgency still in it. That evening she carried the ledger to Miss Penrose, the schoolteacher who had once taught Eliza to shape capitals properly, and still maintained. Beneath her strict spectacles and starched collars, a loyalty toward the rose she did not advertise. Miss Penrose read the page by lamplight, lips thinning as she went. She remembered, she said slowly, hearing from her own predecessor that Martha Roa had once underwritten the school coal during the worst winter and later refused public praise for it. She remembered also an argument years before between Martha and Silas Vane's father, Orrin, about the meadow and relief rights. Though as a young woman then, she had understood neither the stakes nor the wording. Your grandmother kept unusual books, she said, tapping the margin gently. These are household accounts on the face of them, yes, but no woman that exact writes a phrase like trust not void if house falls unless she expects the house to be attacked, sold, or allowed to ruin on purpose. The next day Eliza returned to the smokehouse and examined the north wall where the curing rack had stood. 3 wooden pegs still projected from the interior framing, used once for hanging cloth covers and spare hooks. The 3rd peg from the floor looked no different than the others until she gripped it and found, beneath its smoke-grimed surface, a subtle give. It pulled free in her hand, revealing itself to be not a peg, but the handle of a narrow cedar panel fitted so precisely into the wall she might never have noticed it. Behind it lay a hollow channel between studs, and from that channel she withdrew an oilskin roll tied in butcher's twine, a flat packet sealed with dark wax, and a folded survey map. By then Eliza's hands were trembling badly enough that she had to sit on the threshold to breathe before opening any of it. The map showed the old row plat as filed in 1879. Smokehouse, yard, boarding house, river meadow, and an adjoining strip of spring-fed ground running down toward the fort itself. The line work was careful, the seals legitimate, and the notations in the corner stranger than the property description. Smokehouse parcel and lower meadow jointly bound under relief provision covenant, transferable to row issue or designated steward for common winter supply. The sealed packet contained a copy of that covenant, signed by 3 town founders after Martha advanced provisions, labor, and stock through the winter that saved Cottonwood Ford from emptying out entirely. In exchange, the town had granted the Rose title not merely to a smokehouse lot, but to the lower meadow, a share of the spring run, and the right to keep a public winter reserve there for the relief of residents and travelers in hard season. The covenant explicitly forbade private severance of the smokehouse from the meadow, because, in the language of the time, the house preserved the provisions, and the meadow supplied the hogs and wood by which provision was maintained. There it was, plain as winter light. Vane had not wanted a useless smokehouse. He had wanted to break the legal hinge holding together land, water, and a trust older than his control. The oilskin roll held still more. There were deposit certificates from the Wyoming Territorial Savings Bank in the name of the Row Relief Fund, built from Martha's Army beef contracts and the boarding yard profits, meant to sustain the winter reserve when seasons turned bad again. There was a letter from Lydia, written after Martha's death, saying she had feared Orrin Vane meant to absorb the lower meadow through a revised debt survey, and that she had hidden the originals until Samuel has strength to fight, or Eliza has age to understand. There was also, at the bottom, a page in Samuel's hand roughened by illness, but legible enough. If anything happens to me, do not bargain from fear. The meadow and smokehouse were never ours alone. That is why they matter. If the fund still stands, use it for the town first, and our name second, else Mother's labor was only a different sort of selfishness. We know, when we encounter such lines in the dead handwriting of decent people, that grief changes direction. It stops being only loss and becomes instruction. Still, papers alone do not become power until the living understand them. Over the next several days, Eliza followed the ledger backward and outward, piecing together the shape of what Martha had built. The winter accounts named families who had received meat, seed, flour advances, and no charge allotments during storms and droughts. In the margins, coded by initials, were references to fund disbursements and meadow stock rotations. Miss Penrose helped compare the names to old-school records. Old Ben Mowry, the retired ferryman whose memory remained sharp where his knees had failed, remembered Martha insisting no traveler freeze at the ford if her smokehouse still held bacon. Mrs. Arroyo, whose parents had wintered in a dugout above the river, remembered her mother speaking of roe meat arriving, when even prayers felt thin. Gradually the lost legacy emerged not as some glittering private inheritance, but as something more moving, and in many ways, more dangerous to a man like Cyrus Vane. Proof that the Roes had once served as trustees of the town's conscience, with land and funds legally bound to that service. There remained one problem. The bank receipts were old, and Cottonwood Ford had learned by then that documents left too long to speak for themselves may be spoken over. Eliza needed confirmation the relief fund had not been quietly absorbed, closed, or falsified. The brass key marked R4 offered another thread. Miss Penrose studied it, frowned, and then recalled that before the rail spur shifted south, the Cheyenne office maintained numbered receipt lockers for account holders and contract holders coming in from outlying settlements. R4, she believed, might refer to a registry box rather than a local storage place. Cheyenne lay far enough to require planning, money, and nerve. Eliza possessed very little of the first two, and more of the third than anyone had credited her. She sold the last serviceable silver spoons from Lydia's table to pay a wagon seat south with a freight driver, wrapped the key and papers in oilcloth, and left the smokehouse bolted behind her, with Mrs. Arroyo promising to keep an eye on it. The Cheyenne Bank had grown cleaner, larger, and colder than anything Martha Rowe would have recognized. But institutions, for all their pride, still depend on records kept by human hands. Eliza waited through an entire morning while clerks looked skeptical in increasingly elaborate ways. Then an older cashier with a scar by his jaw took the key, vanished into the back, and returned carrying a narrow steel box coated in dust. Registry Locker R4 had remained unopened since 1888, he said, because the named trustee never appeared, and the account, though largely dormant, had been maintained at minimum balance by standing interest transfers from a territorial bond Martha had purchased after the Army contracts. Eliza opened the box at a side table under watchful eyes. Inside lay a deed confirmation from the county, a certified bond certificate in the name of the Rowe Relief Fund, and a letter from Martha to Lydia written the winter before her death. It was less businesslike than the others, and for that reason cut deeper. She wrote that hard times always tempt polished men to call mercy inefficient, that Orrin Vane already spoke of converting the meadow to private use, and that if the worst came, Lydia must remember the covenant was never about preserving family pride, but about preserving a place where nobody in Cottonwood Ford would have to choose between begging and freezing. A smokehouse, Martha wrote, is only a box of boards until someone decides what it is for. Ours is for keeping what would otherwise be lost. When Eliza returned with the Cheyenne confirmations, Cyrus Vane knew something had shifted even before he knew what. He sent for her the next morning. This time he did not pretend at condolence. He asked, very smoothly, what business had taken her to Cheyenne, and whether she understood how dangerous it could be for a homeless young woman to travel alone with papers she barely comprehended. He offered $25 if she would sign over the smokehouse tract then and there, leave Cottonwood Ford on the next South coach, and spare the town the confusion of old women's books and expired ideals. $25 was more money than Eliza had ever held at one time. It was enough to buy respectability somewhere strangers had not seen her turned out. She looked at the bills, then at the man across from her, and heard Samuel's last instruction with painful clarity. Do not bargain from fear. If the smokehouse is nothing, she asked, why pay so much for it? Cyrus's answer was a smile with no warmth in it, because confusion has a way of becoming expensive. From that point, the conflict stopped dressing itself entirely in courtesy. Vane had the assessor question the separate tax sale. He had the sheriff mention structural condemnation. He suggested to Mrs. Arroyo that continued assistance to Eliza might jeopardize her flower line. He spread the rumor that Eliza meant to seize the lower spring and charge desperate families for water. In a town already skittish from 2 poor seasons, the rumor found ready soil. People who had loved the rose in memory found it harder to love their claims in practice if those claims threatened the man who still extended credit on lamp oil and seed. One evening Eliza returned to the smokehouse to find the door jimmied and the wall cavity emptied where she had once hidden the deed copies. Her breath stopped in her chest, but only for a moment. Samuel had taught her never to store everything in the obvious place. The originals were beneath the floor hatch, wrapped in canvas and ash. The thieves had taken only decoys and Lydia's old apron. Even so, the violation shook her. It told her Vane's fear had moved from paperwork into action. The next week, an early cold front swept down from the north, flattening the late grass and frosting water buckets solid before dawn. Cottonwood Ford began speaking in worried voices about winter feed and how little salt pork remained in private stores. Freight from the south was delayed. Vane's Mercantile raised prices in anticipation of shortage. That was when Eliza understood that the legacy in her hands would matter only partly in court. If Martha's covenant meant anything, it had to mean relief now, in the season for which it had been made, while lawyers and magistrates still sorted seals. She took one of the bank certificates to Cheyenne's branch agent in Laramie County, drew the minimum lawful amount against the bond, and spent it not on fine clothes or travel, or even her own long-deferred comfort, but on barrels of salt, beans, 2 hogsides, lamp oil, medicinal spirits, and a load of split oak hauled back at cost by a driver whose mother had once eaten roe bacon after a blizzard. Then she reopened the smokehouse, not all at once, and not romantically. There was hard labor first. The roof had to be patched with salvaged shingles and tarred canvas. The lower vent needed rehinging. The curing rack had to be reset above the hatch and reinforced. Old crocks were scoured with ash and boiling water. Mrs. Arroyo brought her sons to carry wood. Miss Penrose took over the accounts in the evenings, with a precision that made every donated pound of beans seem almost military. Ben Mowry supervised the cleaning of the Meadow Spring outlet. Even people still uncertain about the legal claims began helping because winter had arrived earlier than argument could conclude, and a working smokehouse looked less like rebellion than common sense. Before long the yard carried a smell Cottonwood Ford had not known properly in years. Fresh-cut oak, hot iron, pepper, brine, and the first thin, sweet smoke rolling from the vent cap against cold air. Cyrus Vane answered by calling a public meeting at the church and framing himself as defender of order against sentimental disorder. He warned that unauthorized use of disputed funds endangered every contract in town. He spoke of reckless girls, forged papers, unstable accounts, and the danger of turning charity into governance. For a few uneasy minutes, his voice almost restored the old arrangement, the one in which fear mistook itself for prudence. Then Miss Penrose rose from the second pew and read aloud, in that classroom voice no one had ever successfully interrupted, the covenant clause binding the smokehouse and meadow to common winter provision. Ben Mowry testified that he remembered Orrin Vane cursing Martha Rowe for refusing to sell the lower spring at famine prices. Mrs. Arroyo held up Lydia's letter and said, with a steadiness nobody who knew her laundry bent had expected, that decent women do not fabricate the dead in order to save themselves. They save others, because that is what the dead taught them. The room shifted. We can feel such shifts when they happen. They are rarely loud. They simply make lies sound suddenly lonelier than before. Vane was too seasoned to surrender in a church. He demanded a county review and secured one, certain that official boredom and technicality would return the matter to his favor. The hearing was set for the first week of November. In the days before it, the weather worsened. A wet snow came early, then froze hard. 2 freight teams failed to reach town. Families started cutting wood they had meant to save. Eliza kept the smokehouse fire low and constant, curing the hogsides, rendering what fat she could, and turning the place into a night refuge for travelers caught at the ford. Children came with pails for broth. Old men came for warmth, and pretended it was only to see whether the roof still leaked. Every ladle she lifted from the kettle altered the town's understanding more effectively than any speech. The Rowe legacy ceased being an abstraction then. It became supper, warmth, and the old humiliating relief of not having to beg. The hearing itself took place in the schoolhouse, because it was the only room with enough benches and a stove large enough to keep the ink from freezing. County Commissioner Hale arrived wrapped in buffalo coat and inconvenience. Cyrus Vane brought a lawyer from Rawlins and 3 ledgers bound in red leather to suggest authority by color, if not by merit. Eliza brought Martha's covenant, the Cheyenne bond certificate, Lydia's letter, Samuel's note, the plat map, and the old household ledger with page 63 marked by a ribbon cut from Lydia's dress hem. She wore her plainest dark gown, mended twice at the cuffs, and stood with both hands on the table as if bracing not herself, but the papers. Vane's lawyer argued first. He called the covenant archaic, the relief fund dormant, the smokehouse derelict, and the claimant emotionally compromised by bereavement and dispossession. He suggested the Roes had long functioned merely as debtors upon land no longer legally theirs. He said continuity of management favored Vane, and that charity, however admirable, did not constitute title. Then Eliza spoke. She did not speak as lawyers do, which helped her. She spoke as a woman raised by people who had spent lives distinguishing between spoilage and preservation. She laid out the tax sale proving the smokehouse tract passed separately. She demonstrated the covenant tying that tract to the lower meadow and relief rights. She showed the bank receipts, the registry key, the bond certificate maintained through interest, and the page from Martha's ledger stating the trust survived even if the house fell. She produced witness testimony from Ben Mowry and Mrs. Arroyo. She read Samuel's line about using the fund for the town first and the row name second, which moved more than one person because it sounded so unmistakably like the man himself. When Vane's lawyer tried to dismiss the household ledger as domestic miscellany, Miss Penrose said dryly that half the frontier had been preserved by domestic miscellany, and the other half starved for lack of it. Even Commissioner Hale allowed himself the smallest sound that might have been approval. What broke the matter, however, was not eloquence, but greed caught leaning too far forward. Under questioning about his interest in the smokehouse tract, Cyrus admitted that Orrin Vane had long considered the lower meadow necessary for consolidating spring rights. Commissioner Hale asked why, if the structure and tract were worthless, the Vane family had pursued them across 2 generations and 3 revised debt instruments. Cyrus answered too quickly. He said because the Roes had never used them efficiently. That word efficiently hung in the room like smoke. Everyone there knew, suddenly and unmistakably, what sort of calculus he meant. Land useful only if privately leveraged, provisions worthwhile only if profitable, mercy tolerable only when it could be billed later. Hale looked from the covenant to the half-frozen faces on the benches, to Eliza's raw-knuckled hands, and then to the notes in Vane's ledger where winter charges had already been marked upward in anticipation of shortage. The old arrangement, at last, had been seen clearly enough to shame itself. Commissioner Hale issued an immediate order restoring temporary stewardship of the smokehouse tract, Lower Meadow, and relief fund operations to Eliza Rowe pending final county filing, freezing Vane's claim over the spring-linked parcel, and directing an audit of all debt revisions touching former Rowe property. It was not the whole victory, not yet, but it moved authority where it needed to move before deeper winter arrived. Eliza returned to the smokehouse that evening, not triumphant exactly, but solemn, because real burdens feel heavier at the moment they are finally acknowledged. Snow had begun again. There were already 3 women waiting by the door with jars, and 1 man asking whether the meadow might be opened for limited hog forage under supervision. She set the kettle on, opened the account book Miss Penrose had ruled for the new season, and wrote on the first page in a hand steadier than she felt, Rowe Winterhouse, reopened for common relief, November 1893. The final restoration unfolded not in a single dramatic burst, but by the patient multiplication of fair decisions. The county audit proved what Cyrus had hidden under arithmetic: inflated penalties, duplicate interest entries, and an unlawful attempt to fold the lower meadow into general collateral without reference to the covenant. He lost the disputed tract outright and was ordered to return portions of fees improperly collected from the old spring rights. The bond certificates, modest but real, yielded enough to restock the winter reserve once the first cured batch sold at fair price. Eliza hired 2 widows to help with salting and accounts. The meadow, once nearly fenced into Vane's private plans, supplied hog feed and wood rights again under posted rules anybody could read. She kept those rules plain on purpose. No family refused in snow. No widow charged interest before thaw. Travelers 1 night only, broth free, meat at cost if work unavailable. Credit written openly. Water from the lower spring, not to be denied for inability to pay. In this way the lost legacy ceased being lost at all. It became practice restored. Cottonwood Ford changed under that restoration the way cold hands change near a stove, not instantaneously, but visibly if one watches with patience. The smokehouse yard grew busy. Boys hauled oak and learned to stack it properly. Women who had once whispered now came to hang muslin, grind pepper, or ladle soup. Men brought pork bellies from small holdings and received fair cure shares instead of whatever Vane's mercantile had decided they were worth that week. Miss Penrose started keeping a shelf of borrowed books in the side room because so many children waited there at dusk for their mothers to finish work. Mrs. Arroyo proposed, and Eliza agreed, that one corner be fitted with benches for any traveler or local woman temporarily displaced by bad luck. A smokehouse is only a box of boards until someone decides what it is for, Martha had written, and now her descendants, blood and otherwise, were deciding again. As for Cyrus Vane, his justice arrived in the quiet Western manner that often cuts deepest. No crowd chased him from town. No one threw stones through his windows. Instead, the audit called his solvency into question, merchants farther east tightened his credit, and townspeople who once lowered their voices when he passed began speaking at ordinary volume. The spring fees he had planned to consolidate were lost. The house he had meant to enlarge went unpainted another year. He retained the mercantile, but not the aura that had made every counter there feel like a judge's bench. By late winter he had to sell 2 warehouse shares and dismiss his clerk. The greater punishment, perhaps, lay in having to watch the old Row smokehouse, the structure he had called useless, become the warmest and most trusted place in Cottonwood Ford precisely because Eliza used it for the purpose he least understood. Men greeted her first on the boardwalk now. Women brought her letters to read and contracts to inspect. When she passed Vane's office windows, it was he who looked up and found the room no longer arranged in his favor. Yet the deepest part of the legacy was not legal and not even financial. It was moral architecture, the shape of a place rebuilt around remembered obligations. Eliza might have used the covenant and fund to recover only her own house and meadow, and nobody with clean conscience would have blamed her. She had slept cold, been turned out, watched her parents' goods sold in daylight, and nearly bartered her future to get through one cruel season. But Samuel's note, and Lydia's caution, and Martha's relentless pity all tugged in the same direction. So when spring loosened the river and the lower road opened, Eliza did repair the old boarding-house porch, but she did it only after posting notice that the smokehouse would remain first a relief house and curing place, second a business. She renamed it, not after herself, but after the promise that made it matter, Rowe Winter House. Under the name she hung a smaller painted board Miss Penrose lettered by hand, "Keep what would otherwise be lost." And so we come back, as all worthwhile stories do, to the image that first seemed too small to matter, a homeless girl spending $2 on a crumbling smokehouse, while other people laughed openly at the foolishness of it. They were not wrong about the desperation. It was desperate. It was cold, humiliating, and absurd by the bright standards of safer lives. Yet desperation is not always the enemy of wisdom. Sometimes it strips away every purchase except the truest one. Eliza Rowe did not buy that smokehouse because she expected mystery under the floor. She bought it because all neglected things recognize one another for a moment, and because somewhere inside her grief, she still understood what her people had built. Beneath the curing rack she found a hatch, and beneath that hatch she found the ledger, the covenant, the bond receipts, the letters, and the old fierce grammar of duty that had once held Cottonwood Ford together. But the lost legacy was not only land and a fund and a family claim. It was the knowledge that preservation is a kind of love with a work apron on. That mercy can be written into timber and law if someone is stubborn enough, and that what powerful men call worthless is often only the piece standing between them and everybody else's dignity. When people later spoke of Eliza, they spoke of the secret hatch, yes, and the papers, and the winter she saved with smoke and salt and clean accounts. But more than that, they spoke of the way she made a forgotten building tell the truth again, and in doing so gave her family name back not grandeur, but purpose. That, in the end, was the real legacy waiting under the rack all along. Thank you for staying with us through the story of Eliza Rowe and the old smokehouse at Cottonwood Ford. If this one lingered with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that neglect and worth are never the same thing, and that what looks ruined may still be guarding the best part of a family's name. Before you go, tell us this. When was a time you found real value in something others had already dismissed? Until next time, stay close.